Hello and welcome to a special on-the-road edition of The Curator on Monocle Radio with me, Carlotta Rebello. Over the next 60 minutes, we'll be bringing you some of the very best interviews and reports from the past year of coverage on Monocle Radio with highlights from our team around the world. This week, in part 2 of our best of 25 shows, we head to Paris to meet the Canadian pop star Charlotte Cardin.
It was a song that is obviously very lighthearted and felt very good when we played it live, and it was just this very light song, and I kind of needed that in the discography of that album, but it kind of went a little bit under the radar.
Plus, we stop off in Switzerland for Eurovision to find out what makes a great host city.
It needs its own identity, which is connected to the host country in an ideal world. And that's what we did in a way. But this identity has to be really, really strong, because you always go back to this kind of, let's call it, generic look.
All that and much, much more over the next hour, right here on this special edition of The Curator with me, Carlotta Rebello. As we recap the best of Monocle on the road over the past year, let's hear our first highlight from January. From creating more resilient cities to how architecture can lift a community, cities hold the key to meaningful change in the world. I traveled to the World Economic Forum's annual meeting in Davos and spoke with Anna Claudia Rosbach, the Executive Director of UN Habitat, the United Nations Agency on Housing, to find out where cities are headed next.
So the New Urban Agenda is a set of principles, actually. We don't have indicators or targets as such, right? So what kind of principles? Principles of including everybody, right? Leaving no one behind, putting housing at the center, participatory multi-level governance, maximizing the built environment, but also recognizing the social and ecological function of the land. These are the types of principles set by the New Urban Agenda. I do believe we advanced in many countries, in many cities. So if we look, we have, in many cities, master plans that are more clear, that are more transparent, that are less technocratic, and encompasses a broader, comprehensive view of the city, plans that are focused on people, plans that are focused on nature. We have many countries that reviewed their national urban framework, also with laws that are more aligned with the principles of the New Urban Agenda. I can give you some examples. In Latin America, for example, I like the master plan of the city of Bogota by the former mayor Claudia Lopes. The master plans embeds, for example, a concept of cities of care. So it's really earmarking areas of the city where care facilities need to be connected to housing and support women in their way for work, in their way for the school, education, and so on. So basically, there are equipment such as child care, elderly care, even laundry for women, and at the same time preserving the surrounding environments of the city. So these are the types of advances and progress that we can see out there. But one huge setback, and this is connected to the SDG 11.1, because then, yes, the 2030 agenda sets indicators and real targets, is on housing. Clearly, we are facing a global housing crisis right now. In terms of informal settlements, the statistics that we have show that we have more than 1 billion people living in slums. So we are working in updating this information. But we have signals that in regions, for example, Latin America, after COVID, the impact and potential expansion of informal settlements happen, right? If you look at the numbers of the census from Brazil, it shows an increase. Of course, it is related to the change of the methodology and the fact that the Statistics Office is able to collect better information working with cities and communities, which is another advance of the New Urban Agenda. But we have to look seriously at this number and see what happened after COVID. We have a homelessness, historic numbers of people living in homelessness situation, 300 million. All these conflicts are affecting cities and houses. We still have to assess the number of houses also affected by disasters, floodings, fire, etc. So I see that as a stagnation point and as a crisis that we need to tackle. And for me and for UN Habitat, this is the priority focus that we are proposing right in this next phase of the new urban agenda.
You mentioned quite a staggering statistic in the session we just heard, which was that by 2030, nearly 3 billion people would lack access to adequate housing. We know as well that by 2030, the number of people living in cities will increase exponentially. So my question is, how can we ensure we are building more and better in order to provide shelter for everyone who is moving to urbanized areas, who might fall, in the cracks of a system, which is often what happens, and we end up with record numbers of people that are lacking adequate housing?
I will share two main layers on this front. Of course, housing is very complex and is part of an ecosystem. But to simplify, finance and urban. So on the finance framework, we really need to make sure that we have more money flowing into housing in form of public investments, private investments, subsidies, incentives, right? So reorient the financial framework to make sure that funds are flowing to the right places and focus on the right people. On the urban framework, we have to make sure that our laws are up to date at the national level and are supportive of master plans, urban plans that really foresee the provision of housing, that really work with the local communities, the social sector, the academia, the organized community leaders, the private sector, to identify on the ground where housing can be located, because housing will not be built in the abstract. We need land, right? And I mentioned before the social and ecological function of the land. Right now, cities are growing more in territory than in population. So do we have opportunities in the cities to build houses? Do we have vacant and underutilized spaces in cities where we can put social housing? How can we make sure that we build with quality and better located so that women, children, they have access, to schools, to jobs, to opportunities, to culture, everything that a city can offer? Can we rethink the way we live and think about different typologies of housing? So taking one single house, family house, and transforming in 3, 4, 5? Can we think about changing the densities of our cities in a respectful manner to the urban fabric, to the culture, to the context, to the environment, to the social needs? Yes, we can, right? But this requires a mind shift. So for me, making finance work, making urban planning and laws work, matching them both is a challenge. And we can only achieve this challenge, only overcome this challenge, if there is a mindset shift, a cultural shift.
Anna Claudia Rosbach, the Executive Director of UN Habitat, speaking to me at the World Economic Forum 2025. We're headed to Dubai for our next highlight. Carl Pei is the co-founder and CEO of Nothing, a London-based consumer tech company on a mission to make tech fun again. Carl is a friend of Monocle, and since the last time he joined us in the studio in 2023, Nothing has seen significant growth, doubling the size of its business and gaining momentum. For an episode of The Entrepreneurs at the start of 2025, Monocle's Tom Edwards caught up with Carl at the World Government Summit in Dubai to hear the latest news. He began by telling Tom the direction of travel and what he sees as the next big breakthrough in computing.
On one hand, we see these large language models getting better and better and also cheaper and cheaper. And recently with open source models, they're really catching up to those commercial models. So when these big models get better and better, that means the smaller models will also get better and better because the small models are distilled from the big models. So that's one trend that's happening. The second trend is that the compute on a smartphone gets more and more powerful every year. And for the last couple of years, there's increasingly more compute available for AI tasks. So on the chipset, we call it the NPU, Neural Processing Unit. So with models getting smaller and being able to fit into a smartphone, and the models also getting better, that means in a couple of years, everybody will have AGI level intelligence on every single smartphone. So for us, as the only startup in this industry, what we're trying to think about every day is how do we leverage this really big change that's happening very soon to really leapfrog the bigger companies of our industry. hopefully similar to what happened with Nokia and BlackBerry when the smartphone came out.
Talk to me about the sort of glacial pressures that act from without on a business like yours. As you said, you have a positive, disruptive influence. Being a little bit smaller, I guess you have greater dexterity to pivot and change. Since we last spoke, how has managing those pressures been? Whether that's from competitors, whether that's from regulatory authorities, whether it's just trying to harness all of the new technologies that are available. How's the pressure kind of treating you?
Yeah, it's been good. We've developed really positively last year. We're still very small. I think last year we got to 0.2% of the global smartphone market share. But we're growing. We more than doubled the size of our business last year. I remember this conversation with one investor last year. And it's somebody that I pitched the idea to when we just started 4 years ago. And he kind of stopped responding to me at that time. So I met him again last year and he said, hey, when you spoke to us earlier, we thought there was a 95% chance he would fail. So we had an internal discussion and we didn't think it was a good idea. But now we kind of want to say sorry because you've crossed some of the most difficult hurdles and we see your future being very positive. So however we can help in the future, let us know. So I think, last year we really put ourselves on the map. We still operate at a big disadvantage when it comes to the cost of goods sold. Because if you think about us being like 0.2% market share and Samsung being 20% market share, the pricing that we can get on the product is just still very different. So we have to keep growing, have to keep increasing the volume so we have more purchasing power. But at the same time, in terms of innovation, it's been way easier for us to navigate than bigger companies. In fact, a lot of our suppliers, they come to us for new ideas that we could work on together because working with the traditional smartphone companies is just going to be very slow. And then from a consumer perspective, we're able to take way more risk. So we talked about AGI on every phone in a couple of years. How does that look like? How does it feel like? For us, we can be super opinionated about it. For instance, theoretically, we can say, hey, let's make the phone come alive. Let's take this inanimate object, this tool, and give it life, and give it a personality, and make it your best friend. And your best friend is not just an intern there waiting for you to give it orders. Your best friend will proactively come to you at times, have a conversation with you. Sometimes when you order it to do something, your friend is not going to just oblige. It's going to push back on you. Like, okay, that's from a technical perspective, maybe not super hard to do, but the bigger companies will not dare to take a route like this because they have too many users. It's going to be too jarring, too confusing to a lot of their users. But I think within AI, technology is increasingly becoming commoditized. So the hard problem is increasingly not the technology anymore because there's just so much money invested on the tech side and so many smart people working on that problem. It's going to become a commodity. The next big problem to solve is the user experience. What is the user experience that's going to really resonate with users at scale? I think a lot about the iPod. It was my first Apple product. I really love that product. And back in the days of the iPod, there was also consensus that hard drives in MP3 players would be a really great thing. You had the Creative, you had iRiver, you had Apple, you had a bunch of companies all building this type of product. But ultimately, only one company created the de facto standard for the industry, which was Apple. They had the best design, best user experience with a click wheel. They had the best hardware, software integration with iTunes for music management. They had the best business model. You could buy a song for $1 instead of buying the entire album. They had the best overall experience. So similarly today, everybody knows that there's going to be a new operating system powered by all the advancements we see in AI. But who can build that product market fit? I don't know. It might not be the big companies.
Watch this space, right? Well, just to that point, and I know, again, we unpacked this a little bit when we last spoke, Carl, but what's the sweet spot for you in terms of that growth of the business? As you said, you have to grow, you have to be ambitious and quite aggressive because you need to get some of these economies of scale. But then at the same time, you want to keep that flexibility and dexterity and to be able to flex the muscles that give you the advantage in storytelling and personalization and so forth. So whether it's a conversation with investors or around the boardroom table, how do you calibrate what that growth story needs to look like to balance up those different priorities?
I think we're quite far away from facing that problem, given that we're 0.2% of the market. I think once we get to like 10, 15%, that will be a very hard balance between having a very stable core business that's profitable and also trying to invent the future. It's not a top of mind problem right now, but when the time comes, I think we need to structure the company in a different way than how it's traditionally been done. If you look at Apple, under Tim Cook, they built a very good culture for optimization, taking great ideas and really maximizing the profits from those ideas. But if your company is a monoculture, that means your company can only do that thing, optimize. So when we get big enough to have to balance optimization with innovation, I think we need to create two different company cultures within the same company. Or else I just don't see how it's going to work.
That was Carl Pei, the co-founder and CEO of Nothing, in conversation with Tom Edwards. The next stop on our global tour is Switzerland. German production designer Florian Vida knows a thing or two about Eurovision staging. Basel was his 9th Eurovision. Florian has staged everything from Adele's concerts in Munich to WrestleMania in the US. With Swiss roots himself, Florian used Swiss mountains and the country's language diversity for inspiration while designing the Eurovision stage. Monocle Radio's Fernando Augusto Pacheco spoke with him in Basel and began by asking him to share the 3 key design elements of the stage for the 2025 edition of the event.
When I started working on the show, there's one design element which is Karl Gerstner's Swiss grid, which comes from the graphic world, and then within this grid, actually almost everything can happen. And I thought this has to be part of the design, and we have to incorporate it somehow. So we turn it into a 3-dimensional grid, but it's invisible. It lives behind the screen, and it can be visible in certain moments. And we turn it into a grid with an active surface. Quite interesting toy to play with. And the second thing is, I thought what makes Switzerland so special is the 4 different languages. And I was looking for something that stands for these 4 languages. So that's how we came up with this frame. So the 4 sides of this letterbox frame. So this stands for the 4 different languages here. And then the mountains is probably the most obvious one, because the other 2 got to be explained. And the mountains is that's the part of the creative that is easy to read.
And the letterbox frame, that's quite unusual. I think that's the element of the staging that I was quite surprised because of it. It's huge.
Yeah, it is massive. And to be honest, it also has a purpose. It's not only a design purpose, it also has a functional purpose. The issue with this venue, which I think works really, really well, also in terms of scale and size, looks great on TV, but there's one big issue that you can't hang anything from the ceiling. And on a show like this, you need lighting and tons of other stuff and toys that need to be hung from the ceiling. We knew that there's a massive ground-supported truss structure needed to make this work, and we tried to hide this as good as possible. So the upstage legs are actually behind the grid and the screen, so you can't see them at all. But then we still had the remaining 2 legs somewhere in the middle of the room, and I was looking for something to play with. And to be honest, we had these 2 legs, and then we came up with the idea of the frame to incorporate these 2 massive truss legs. And this is why it's in the middle of the room, but I think it works pretty well. So we turned.
It's grandiose.
Exactly. We turned it into a functional design piece. Yeah. So this is why there is this frame, not only for design reasons, but it's interesting because it multi-layers the room in a very interesting way, and you can use it in different directions. So you can shoot it dead center with the screen in the background and the main stage, and then the frame itself also has a stage, so you can also perform within the frame. And then if you shoot in the other direction, you can still use the frame as a kind of letterbox, and you have the green room in the background.
And a question to you, Florian. I mean, I was talking to Martin Osterdahl earlier this year. I mean, the challenge, because you have 26 artists in the final. How to do that? I mean, there must be so much planning before.
Well, the basics, or the 26 countries or individual countries are actually not the challenging part. So what the show needs, or there are two things that a show or a Eurovision stage actually, or a set in general needs, which is it needs its own identity, which is connected to the host country in an ideal world, and that's what we did in a way. But this identity has to be really, really strong, because you always go back to this kind of, let's call it generic look, which is important. And then, of course, you have all the individual performances. And in an ideal world, each performance is completely different. That's at least the goal. But most of the creative, when it comes to the performances and the performance looks, is coming from the delegations. So you have to come up with something that inspires them, and it has to be an ideal platform, ideally not very limiting. So the more they can do with it, the better it is. And of course, when we came up with this concept, we already presented them a couple of different ways how the stage can be used, and I was honestly so surprised, because there is so much, and they're doing stuff I haven't even thought about. So it's great. So it's a good year.
And the artists, they have sometimes those massive props. Do you have, maybe not you personally, but you have to say a lot of no's to the artists,
I mean, before they start thinking about props, they usually getting like a deck with information saying, okay, the prop can't be bigger than whatever, like 2.5 meters high, 4 whatever meters long, could be like 2 or 3 pieces. So most of the stuff has to be divided, because we have to funnel this or all the props through like a slightly lower area, and it's usually the lowest door that counts. So it has to fit through certain areas to make this work.
That was Monocle's senior correspondent Fernando Augusto Pacheco reporting from Eurovision 2025 in Basel. Our next highlight comes from an event that took place a little closer to home. In May, the team behind Meet the Writers packed their bags and hit the road for the Hay Festival of Literature and Arts in the Welsh town of Hay-on-Wye. In this highlight, the show's host, Georgina Godwin, spoke to Argentine author Agustina Basterrica about her shift from opera to writing, literary influences, and her novels exploring oppression, capitalism, and control.
Let's talk about Tender is the Flesh, which really put you on the map. 2017, a dystopian novel. It won major awards. And this is where mass hysteria happens when a deadly virus jumps from animals to humans. So far, so familiar. But of course, this happened. You wrote this before COVID.
Yeah. In the novel, the virus, you never know if it is real or if it's an invention, But I thought about a virus because I never write fantasy. It's not that, for example, aliens came and we became all cannibals. I think that this, if all the conditions are there, really could happen. And it's crazy because a reader sent me a podcast that were 2 guys from United States talking about the novel. And they really like the novel, but they say this could never happen because a government will never take your animals and kill them. And I thought, you never lived in Latin America, man, because in Latin America, in my country in the 70s, the government took your loved ones from their houses, they tortured them, they killed them, and they disappeared their bodies. And they did this on purpose because they wanted you to never have the closure, So, government can do all of that.
The book is really an examination of capitalism.
Yes.
Tell us more.
You can read the plot literally. Of course, there were groups that ate human flesh, and it was justified, but you can also read it as a symbol of what we do with other beings. We eat symbolically other beings, for example, with prostitution with kids. You're consuming their energy in Argentina, well, in Latin America, there are a lot of bordellos that are clandestine.
Yeah.
A lot of women that there are working as slaves because they were taken from the street or they were... So that is a way of consuming them also. So we treat other humans as if they were things and not our peers. And we do that also with animals and with nature. So I'm trying to think about that in my book.
Let's come to your latest work now.
Yeah.
It's called The Unworthy, and it's kind of about religion. The society is governed by he and the superior sister. Tell us more.
I went to a nun school, a German nun school in Buenos Aires, and it was a really bad experience. You can realize if you read the book.
A convent, a Catholic convent.
Yeah, not a convent, a school,
yeah.
A high society school
Yeah.
with nuns. And the structure was the same as this book. We were all girls, all professors, women, the nuns, and the priest. Like, that is the structure. And what they did is that they talk about love, because Jesus in the Bible talks about love. But of course, they deformed everything because they talk about that, but at the same time, they teach you to control your companions and to judge them, and you are always being suspected of being unworthy, and of course a whore, because your virginity was like something you have to really kept there.
I'm feeling your pain. I went to a very similar school.
Oh my God, so you understand everything. And there was no companionship, there was no sorority, because of course if we were controlling ourselves, the nuns, well, they control you also, and you were submissive, So the idea came later, but I mean the German was there, I lived that experience.
So it's about control. It's about living in an oppressive regime. It's told from the first person.
Yes.
Yeah, and really about the ruined state of the world outside.
Yes, because I like to take to the extremes things that are nesting, and for example, the climate change. Although Trump and the president of my country are denying the climate change, because of course the people that pay their campaigns are the enterprises that contaminate everything, it's real. It's real because, for example, in Argentina, we have a town that is called Bahía Blanca that was this year got flooded, and a lot of people lost their houses, and a lot of people die because of that. You can see the fires on Los Angeles. You can see a lot of different catastrophes all around the world. And so I take that to the extreme that all of that passed and we have nothing, And so these girls, they have only this convent where you have a cult, and not a nice cult.
That was the author Agustina Basterrica in conversation with Monocle's Georgina Godwin. Still to come, here on The Curator, we head to Paris to meet the Canadian pop star Charlotte Cardin, explore Barcelona for the 10th edition of Monocle's Quality of Life conference, and stop off in Florida to meet the founder of Miami Book Fair. Stay tuned.
Craft matters, in small ways, like how a coffee is brewed, and in not-so-small ways, like how your money is cared for, which is why for 160 years, UBS has elevated banking to a craft, tailoring unique strategies that combine human expertise with the latest technologies, all happening across 24 time zones and 12 key financial hubs, with you at the heart of it all. UBS, banking is our craft.
You're with a special edition of The Curator, our weekly highlights show here on Monocle Radio. I'm Carlotta Rebello. In July, Monocle's Fernando Augusto Pacheco headed to Paris to meet the pop star Charlotte Cardin. With a sound that's both elegant and emotionally raw, Cardin has quietly become one of Canada's most compelling musical exports. Fernando spoke with her in our Paris studio about her future music plans and how the track Feel Good became one of the defining songs of the summer.
Feel Good totally has had like a completely new life in the last few months. So actually what's interesting about Feel Good is that I feel like ever since the first demo, it's had so many different lives, because I first wrote that song all in English, and there was something about it that didn't quite stick. Like, I loved the chorus, but there was something about the verses I didn't like as much. So I ended up not putting it on my initial album, 99 Nights. And once we put out the album, I kept going back to that chorus, and I felt like it had something that was really special, and I would like play it for my friends, and they had this like guilty pleasure attachment to it almost, and I felt the same way. And I was like, okay, how about we go back into the studio and we translate the verses and make a bilingual version of Feel Good and make it mostly in French, and see if that gives it maybe the edge that I felt it was missing, maybe the touch of originality I felt it didn't have back then. And so we translated it, but it had many, many versions before we figured out this current version that we know. And we ended up putting it on the re-edition of the album, so like the deluxe version of my 99 Nights album. And it kind of, it was a song that is obviously very lighthearted and felt very good when we played it live, and it was just this like very light song, and I kind of needed that in my, I think, in the discography of that album. But it kind of went a little bit under the radar. Like, a few radios picked it up and it had a tiny little bit of traction, but like really not that much. And about a year and a half after the release of Feel Good, I performed the song on a show called Star Academy here. So it's kind of like The Voice. It's like a singing competition. And so they invited me to sing my song with one of the contestants. And from there, it just kind of snowballed into a huge TikTok moments. In the following days, thousands of videos on TikTok were using my song Feel Good. And then a few days or weeks after that, all the biggest radios in France really started playing it like massively. And so it really...
You're literally on the top 10 of the French charts.
Yeah, and
Incredible.
it's been in the top 10 for the past few months. Like, it's just kind of staying up there, which is such a big surprise and a lovely surprise in my life, because the music industry now goes so fast. There are tens of thousands of songs that are put out every single day on platforms. And so you kind of expect music to have a much shorter life expectancy. And so to see my song kind of blow up almost 2 years after its release is just really encouraging and kind of super exciting for the future.
You make me feel good.
And I think TikTok obviously has some disadvantages, but for that, I think it's special because it can actually help songs that came out years ago have a moment. Like, I think of that Fleetwood Mac song that's been completely discovered by a new generation. Obviously, it always stayed a classic, but you think of Kate Bush, who is now super popular among Gen Zs and all of that, and that's because TikTok has that power to kind of just show songs to a lot of people. And so that's kind of what happened with Feel Good.
And in a way, you leave it in the hands of the fans as well. Is it true the case? So, for example, I've been reading that, before the label said you need to release this as a single, everything was pre-planned. But now when you release a new album, it's kind of the fans will pick the favorite and it will become the organic single, right?
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting. And that's also, the fans are really sensitive and smart, and they're obviously the best way of knowing, what music converts. But now that they have the power on social media, they kind of get that power back, which is really interesting and nice. And so a lot of artists will select singles with their labels and their close circle and then put out the album and be like, oh, wait, actually that the one that I thought wasn't a single is now the single because the fans are directly showing me that that's the one they love. And so that is a really interesting, I think, quality of this era in music.
And this song, I think, for me at least, hit the spot. I think 2025 is being proven to be quite a tough year, geopolitics-wise. It's quite stressy. And I think a song like this, it just hit the spot as well. That's my theory.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think I agree. I think you always need a context for music and art in general to really reach people. And so when I put out the song, it probably just wasn't the right context. People weren't ready to relate to it in the way that I maybe meant for it to when I put it out. And I think that's beautiful because art, you need a context for it. And what's funny about this specific song is that I had been invited on the exact same show, Star Academy, the previous year to sing the same song, and nothing really happened with the performance, and it had come out maybe 6 months prior, and so it was much more fresh, and it just kind of went on under the radar. And now that second time around, same show, I sang it with a contestant this time, which was a little bit different, but still, that's when it just snowballed into this big thing.
That was the musician Charlotte Cardin speaking to Monocle's Fernando Augusto Pacheco. You're with a special edition of The Curator, where this week we're recapping some of the best bits from the past year of Monocle on the Road. To set the scene in the city that we found ourselves for the 10th Quality of Life Conference, Barcelona, Monocle's editor Josh Fennett spoke with editorial illustrator Jordi Labanda, who knows a thing or two about what makes this fascinating city tick. We roped Jordi in to share some of the things that make Barcelona special for him, along with some corresponding illustrations from his archive. Josh began by asking Jordi about why the Gothic Quarter is so important in telling his story of Barcelona.
For me, it's like the laboratory of the city because everything happens there first. It's a place that is based on layers and layers of different cultures that have been visiting us, the Romans, the Arabs, the Jewish, a lot of cultures.
And really sums up maybe that welcoming spirit that you feel today, or maybe Barcelona's openness to fresh ideas. Now, when we did our discussion beforehand, I was thinking of the things that I think most people think of about Barcelona, which is the sea. But you made this point that the city spent most of its history looking away from the sea. Why is that?
Yeah, especially during the big plan of Barcelona that was in 19th century, the bourgeois people, for any reason, thought that the ocean was not good, and they preferred to watch to the mountain, and then the city didn't see to the ocean.
So the sea was a place to work, it was full of trade, it was port.
Yes.
And people here wanted to escape it until the 20th century, the late 19th century, and a sense of rejuvenation and creativity that so defines the city. Modernisme, this is a big question, but why does it matter? What does it tell us?
Modernisme, for us, is something very special because it's around us. It's part of us. Modernisme was, especially for me, a new way to understand life. The architects, especially Gaudí, took a very careful look about how nature is developing. If you see details of Gaudí's architecture, you will see many things related to nature.
And even the beautiful building that we're in today, Art Nouveau happened in other parts of the world, but it didn't quite happen like this. What is it about the Catalan character? You mentioned a word to me yesterday, which I'm going to butcher the pronunciation of, but what is it about this idea of rauxa, and what does that mean?
We have a Catalan word that defines us very well. In fact, it's two. It's seny and rauxa. Seny means being very strict and focused. And rauxa means some kind of crazy audacity. So in this way, I think modernism is a very good example of rauxa.
This city has been a canvas, obviously, for your own work, but for some of the greats of art and architecture. Why did they converge here? You mentioned on our discussion beforehand that Barcelona sometimes look to Europe rather than to Spain for inspiration.
One of the nicest things of Barcelona is that maybe because all this continue visiting of cultures, it's that we are really welcoming. We love everybody. So I think that all these personalities found really, really well here.
We're talking about the city and obviously incredible talent from across the peninsula, but we kind of have to mention one of the most famous pieces of architecture and design, and maybe two dates that can help people place the creative development of the city. One is 1929, the international exhibition where Mies van der Rohe designed his pavilion, the German pavilion, and the other is the Olympics in 1992. Now today, the Olympics can seem like a big burden for cities, but really you feel it changed Barcelona quite profoundly.
Definitely. From 60s, 70s, there was a group of very interesting people in Barcelona called La Gauche Divine. That was an unorganized group of architects, designers, filmmakers, publishers. They worked really hard. Remember that Spain, at that moment, we were under Franco.
Franco's in charge. The Catalan identity is suppressed.
And so they work very hard trying to be more European instead of Spanish. So they were masterminds of design and new things.
And that sense of creativity and sometimes decline, so suppression and activity, has really summed up Barcelona's creative spirit, hasn't it? A moment of being down at heel and then a moment of being up. I guess we have to talk about Barcelona today, the trajectory of it. And you had a wonderful image that you said to me. You described Barcelona as being a little bit like your lover.
Yeah.
You said sometimes you need to have tough words with lovers.
Yeah.
So what on earth did you mean?
Yeah, in fact, well, I'm in love with Barcelona. I mean, I decided to live here and I'm very happy for my decision. But as all the relationships, sometimes it's hard. Now, for me, and I think that I speak for many Barcelonians, we're in a difficult moment because maybe it's too popular, and then the people who live here are feeling like we have a feeling of loss and uncertainty. But, I mean, I love her, and I know she loves me, and we need to talk, but I trust this relationship 100%.
The illustrator Jordi Labanda speaking to Josh Fennert at the 10th edition of Monocle's Quality of Life Conference. And finally on today's show, we head to Florida. For an episode of Meet the Writers, Georgina Godwin spoke to Mitchell Kaplan, the founder of Miami Book Fair. They discussed his switch in career to becoming a bookseller, influencing the city's literary culture and adapting to new reading trends.
So I found myself as a freshman in college who was an English major, studying writing, but at the same time being surrounded by this culture that was there, going to see Anne Waldman on a Wednesday night, or Ginsberg was giving a reading, or W.S. Merwin. And so I was sort of imbued with the sense that literary culture was something that you could make your way in. But I didn't quite learn that until I made a lot of false starts. And my dad was a lawyer, and like English majors everywhere around the world at that time, when you graduated, you didn't know what the hell to do. So I decided to go to law school, thinking, because it was something I was familiar with. I went to a wonderful law school where I was doing some important work, but I found myself in the bookstores all over the place. And finally, I left law school, and I decided that the book business was something that I wanted to be involved in, or literary culture. Another false start was thinking maybe I'd get into publishing, and I made some inquiries into that. And then I ended up back in Miami, where I didn't think I'd be. And Miami became much more interesting when I came back. And it's because it had gone to the bottom of the well. We had the Mariel boat lift. We had riots that were here. We had the beginning of the cocaine trade. South Beach and Art Deco was beginning to emerge. You found some incredible people moving down, developing some of these old rotting buildings into some very interesting things. And I felt like I was sort of watching my city remake itself. And I decided that I would open a bookstore at that point. But before I did that, I was teaching in order to make a living. But as I was teaching, I opened up my very first small little bookshop that you referred to. And so over the last 42 years, I've had a very interesting seat, something unusual probably that not everybody gets to see, to watch their city that they grew up in remake itself and then be somewhat a part of it as well. Nobody thought of Miami as having much of a literary community before we and the Miami Book Fair started. And now they do. There are writers living here. Used to be only mystery writers in Miami. You know, even before Carl Hiatt and people like Charlie Williford, who wrote Miami Blues, and the pulp fiction writers that you think of when you think of cities like Miami. But now you have poets, you have fiction writers, you've got Pulitzer Prize winners, you've got Kingsley Poetry Award winners. Everyone is moving here to Miami. Not everyone, but a lot of people are moving here to Miami because they understand that the diversity that was always Miami is something that feeds them in a way that other cities don't.
So you started with that very small bookshop, but now you are in these magnificent premises. And I wonder if you could just give us a verbal tour of this. You've already taken me around the physical space. I've been so impressed by it. There's a lot of people here today, so we're not going to go and do it right now because I want people to be able to hear what you're saying. But take us on a wander around this space and describe it to us.
Well, you know, I also am fortunate that I got to build the bookstore that I really wanted to. So we started in a small space. Across the street from that space, this building came available. We're in Coral Gables, which is part of Miami. And it's built around a courtyard. It's an historic Mediterranean-style building that has a courtyard right in the middle of it. And it has an entranceway with 3 big arches that are really gorgeous. And we have a bar there. So we have magazines and a bar when you enter the bookshop area.
And it's a really great newsstand area. I noticed lots of varieties of Monocle magazine there too.
Yes, Monocle is something we love, and we've been involved with them for a long time. But so you go, and then you can enter the bookshop from any side, since it is a U-shaped store. And when you walk in on one side, you see a floor-to-ceiling books everywhere you look. And on one of the side, our ceilings are almost 18 feet high. We have a big ladder that gets you up there. And then that is a new and notable room. We have all the new books that are out. And then you wander into one of the rooms. The rooms kind of open up for you, and you wander. It's a real browser's delight, I think, is the bookstore of my dreams, and we've done this here, I think. And you walk into one room and it has art, architecture, design, photography. That's always been a very, very important part of what we do.
And it's probably the biggest collection of art books in the United States in a bookshop?
I don't know if it's the biggest in the United States, but certainly in the South in terms of a bookshop. Maybe south of New York, maybe. But we do a big business in art, architecture, and design because from the beginning, we were very much involved with the School of Architecture at the University of Miami and other things. And then there are artists living here and all of that. So then you wander into the back, and then we have the back end of our cafe. And then you wander to the other side, and we have everything from books in Spanish to paperback fiction to history, biography. But if you can imagine a bookstore that if you could afford to build in a Borgesian way, a bookstore that you could dream of attached to your house, that's what we have in a sense. And we have a children's section, and so there are sections. But the cool thing too is in the center of everything is a courtyard cafe where you can hang out and do your work. We have internet, and you can drink coffee, beer, wine, with a full menu that fortunately my son manages our food and beverage and all of that. So it's really a third place, like the great third places. It's what I've always wanted, a place where after work, after home, you can come and just hang out, meet other people, and feel part of a community.
And of course, in these rooms, we're sitting at the moment in the art and architecture and design room, and the room that mirrors it on the other side, which carries fiction. There are central shelves, but they're on wheels, so you can move those, and you can have events in these spaces. In fact, you could even have 3 events running concurrently.
And we do about 400 events per year out of this one location, and mostly author events, and we also in the courtyard do music on various nights, different kinds of music. So yes, we've had those nights where we've had 3 things going at once, but we could accommodate up to 200, 250 people in one of the rooms, 100, 150 in another. It's not a big bookshop. It's relatively small. The total square footage under air conditioning is about 5,000 square feet. And with the courtyard, it brings it to about 9,000 square feet, which is not huge. So, but it has there's a sense of exploration as you go from one room to the next.
Well, that's all we've got time for on this week's edition of The Curator. The show was produced by Sam Impey and presented by me, Carlotta Rebello. Join us again next year to hear some of the very best of the programs here on Monocle Radio. Goodbye and thanks for listening.